My name is John Beebe, and I founded the Democratic Engagement Exchange here at TMU in the Faculty of Arts. I'm just here this morning to say welcome. I'm going to turn it over to our panel for introductions, let them introduce themselves. This is an incredibly important conversation, but as we said yesterday, we've identified a number of challenges that we're facing, and we'll talk more about those challenges today, but also we're looking forward to solutions. And we'll hear today about how, our election management body are trying to grapple with these real pressing challenges, what they're working on, what they're thinking about, and then also what all of our roles, are being people from civil society, from other election administrators, from academia. What is our role in addressing those issues? So thank you very much for being here. We look forward to a rich day. After this session, we will again have a great little break for you to connect. And then we will have Nahi Nenshi, who's going to talk about a very different approach, and I'll save that for when we introduce him. And then we will have a lunch break where we'll have some very, a room for you to connect with some of the amazing civil society organizations and others who are working in this space, and so you can learn about that work, and then another full afternoon. So thank you for being here. I'll turn it over to Allison for this panel. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, John. So my name is Allison Harell, and I'm a professor at the Université du Québec à Montréal and also the co-director for the Consortium on Electoral Democracy. So it's my real pleasure and honor to moderate this session today, where we're going to have the opportunity to collectively reflect on how we can counter mis and disinformation during an election year. Misinformation and disinformation, as you know, are not necessarily a new problem. There have long been actors, if you think about propaganda going back centuries, the ways in which that actors can mobilize incorrect or misleading information to try and influence politics. I think what's particularly interesting and terrifying about the moment that we live in is that information circulates at incredibly rapid speeds in largely unregulated spaces right now. You can think about the ways in which viral posts circulate, the ways in which we're learning to interact with all these new technologies as they emerge, and also the ways in which technological advances can really be mobilized for both good and evil through the use of algorithms and other technologies. So this presents a really fundamental and I think urgent challenge for electoral management bodies in Canada and around the world. So given these challenges, I think we're really fortunate today to be able to speak with those on the ground and actually trying to counter this through during the electoral process. So we have we're Chief Electoral Officers in the Canadian context here, and I'm going to briefly introduce them. The way this is going to work is I'm going to pose a few questions to kick off the conversation, and then we'll move into a general discussion with the audience. So that's our marching orders for today. So Anton Boegman is British Columbia's Chief Electoral Officer and has been since June of 2018, after serving in senior leadership roles at Elections BC since 2005. He's an acknowledged planning expert and an innovative leader who's passionate about accessible elections and preserving electoral integrity, and I'm sure you'll hear that today. As CEO, he has focused on how election agencies can respond to emerging challenges in election administration, including disinformation and foreign interference. So Chief Electoral Officer Boegman brings a particularly unique perspective to this panel, given BC's recent changes in legislation related to electoral integrity and disinformation and misinformation specifically. We also have with us Greg Essensa, who has been Ontario's Chief Electoral Officer since 2008. He has over 35 years of municipal, provincial, and international election experience. As someone who's been working in election management spaces for many years, his expertise has been sought by governments of all levels, associations, and not-for-profit organizations. He's advised municipal elections in British Columbia, Alberta, Quebec, and New Brunswick, as well as been involved in primary elections in Illinois, North Carolina, Ohio, and Texas. And so I'm really pleased to have you here, among other things, to talk about this sort of multi-level and multi-jurisdiction experience and how that can contribute to the conversation, and particularly types of solutions that we can think of collectively together. So to start off, I'd like to start off with some questions for Anton. So can you tell us a bit more about the changes to the BC Election Act, and in particular the types of policy tools that you have at your disposal to counter disinformation in the upcoming BC election?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm really happy to speak to some of these new topics, and also just in general, I'm very pleased to be here with Greg on this panel. I think it's a really interesting and relevant time to be having this discussion, certainly with 2024 being the year of elections worldwide, and BC on October 19 will be among the, I think, 2 billion people who are going to be voting this year. I think the other aspect that really focuses on this has been the discussion that's been happening in Canada, in particular over the last 18 months around the allegations of foreign interference in our elections, and some of those allegations include elections at all levels, municipal, provincial, as well as federal. And of course, this type of interference can include deliberate disinformation to either suppress voter turnout or to heighten partisan divide, to sow doubt in our institutions, or to sway voter preferences in a particular race. In terms of the changes to BC's electoral law, these were put in place in May of 2023 following a number of reports that I tabled with our legislature on this topic. And they're unique, I think, in Canada in a number of ways. And they authorized me as a Chief Electoral Officer to regulate during the pre-campaign and campaign periods certain types of disinformation. And by disinformation, I mean deliberate falsehoods that could tilt the level playing field or, as I said, materially damage that trust in our democratic processes. So some of the provisions that are in our law are very similar to what is currently in the Canada Elections Act. So these are false statements about candidates and parties and election officials that speak to, their verifiable facts. So whether, they are subject of a criminal investigation, their citizenship, these sorts of things. But some of the other ones are very unique. So I'll just speak to you a little bit about what is covered at a high level, and hopefully that'll give a good perspective of what's in place in BC. So the ones that are, as I said, are not unique. These are the ones of the prohibited false statements about candidates, party officials, and election officials. These are areas where these types of things could have a material impact on a voter's perception of these individuals, especially during the very narrow time constraints of an election campaign. The false statements about voting processes, which are new in our legislation, there were other provisions which spoke to this, but not in a very clear way. And so now it's prohibited to have false, deliberate disinformation about voting opportunities. So for example, if someone was to post that election day is on a Tuesday in British Columbia, when it's on a Saturday, that would fall under those categories. Or if that you can vote by texting, 2652, those sorts of things would be prohibited. There's also restrictions on making deliberate false statements about election results. So this is a new piece, and it was intended to prevent the kind of thing that we saw south of the border in 2020 with the big lie that the US election was stolen. So these prohibitions are on disinformation about the voting results and about vendors that supply equipment to election administration bodies. So these are the ones that provide tabulators or electronic poll book software, these sorts of things. And so these specific ones are intended to address false statements that could reduce the public confidence and trust in the election results. The really unique prohibitions in our laws, those, are the ones that relate to misrepresentation and impersonation. And while the way that these are crafted, they don't specifically mention deepfakes or synthetic media, those would be covered in our legislation. So it's prohibited to represent yourself, or I suppose your AI avatar as a candidate or as a party leader or an official, or to falsely transmit information as if you were them. So the new protection is quite broad. It would cover some of the deepfakes that we've already seen in other elections, such as in the New Hampshire primary, where there was an audio deepfake purporting to be from President Biden telling voters to vote on a different day. Or even there were a number of fake audio clips that occurred in Poland's national election that are, that are suggested that these could have actually swayed the results in that election. When I identify a prohibited false statement, I can issue an order to stop transmitting. So this could go either to the individual who made that statement or to the platform that's hosting it. And this is really analogous to what is probably present, excuse me, in most election law, where an administrator can cover up or remove non-compliant advertising, whether that's on a billboard or a placard, say for instance if that's within 100 feet of a voting place or something like that. And if they do not stop the transmission, then that's when we can start moving into some of the enforcement techniques, which include monetary penalties of up to $50,000 per day, or offense prosecutions.
Wow, so thanks for that explanation. It sounds like you have some existing and some new tools at your disposal. So are there specific challenges in translating these laws into action for this upcoming election? Do you foresee some challenges there? And what happens if platforms who are powerful and just ignore you? Like what happens then?
Yeah, so I think with any new legislative change, a ton of work has to go into understanding the scope of the prohibitions, understanding really what's meant by the letter of the legislation, and then how that can be applied in a practical sense. For instance, a key part of the new prohibitions are that the false statements, they have to affect the results of the election. They must be intended to do so. So how would you determine that level of intent? So that's obviously something we've been looking at. There's parodies, of course, for parody, exemptions for parody or satire in there. So is something satirical or is it not satirical? So a lot of that work, we obviously worked with our legal counsel to understand those nuances and how we could reflect that in our internal policies and in our directions that we'll be giving to our staff who are going to be working in this area. I think some other areas where we needed to do planning around was, well, okay, where are these, the complaints going to come in? Where are we going to see them? Are we going to be doing proactive monitoring? Are we going to be responding to public complaints? Likely, we're going to be looking across that range. At all ways, the information could be coming to us. So how do we map out the process flows and provide the resources to the people who are going to be seeing and dealing with those coming in? So, templates and decision trees and things like that. We've also been engaging with the platforms. And our experience actually is that when there are laws that are in place, the platforms are interested in engaging and they want to be in compliance with these laws. So we've produced material for them. We've had meetings with a number of the major platforms on what these new laws are. Some actually reached out to us when the new provisions had been introduced into the legislature, when they had not yet been debated or passed into law, because they wanted to better understand those provisions. I think it was Google that reached out to us before that. For sure, a platform could ignore us, right? And even though, a penalty of $50,000 a day could add up, it's not like some of the laws in the EU where the penalties to a platform for non-compliance are percentages of their revenue or things like that. But again, I think it's a good starting point. We've had really good engagement with the platforms thus far, and our expectation is that there will continue to be follow through from them. As with all communications activity that take place in a digital environment, there are things that could be extraterritorial, and there are challenges there that are very hard to deal with, because in some places you just don't have the jurisdiction to be able to order a takedown if something's being hosted in China, in Asia, or somewhere else.
Great. Greg, let's turn to you and get you included in this conversation. So I'm really curious to hear about what's going on elsewhere. Anton had mentioned a few other examples south of the border, but what do you really see as the most difficult issues related to misinformation as it relates to electoral integrity that we should be focused on in this current moment? And particularly what's going on beyond what we've heard about in the BC legislation?
Thanks, Allison. Thank you very much, and thank you for the question. I think there's a couple of, this is definitely a worldwide issue. This is not something that is just immune to us in Canada. And we are seeing from a policy front a number of different jurisdictions trying to move forward with legislative reforms. Here in Canada, as we've heard yesterday, there's different bills going forward at Parliament. There are a bunch of different jurisdictions, Saskatchewan, Northwest Territories, Quebec, Ontario, who have all made recommendations in various reports to their legislatures, but are quite honestly sort of lagging behind. I applaud BC that they have gone far beyond any jurisdiction here in Canada. But we also see, in other jurisdictions, the EU, in March of 2024, they passed a regulation really looking at transparency obligations and targeting restrictions for online ads that are considered political. They have a new definition of political advertising, all to take effect in 2024. And jurisdictions like Australia, they empowered actually their comms and media authority. They gave them new powers to have oversight over some of the content on social media platforms. And certainly south of the border, we're seeing a ton. Upwards of 40 different states have bills at various states. Most of the largest states have something in place, California, Texas, all around sort of providing authorities in different levels, whether they be electoral management bodies or other regulators, the ability to really try to address this issue of mis and disinformation. But for us, what I see as the biggest difficulty is the lack of a complete toolkit. Obviously, legislation is one piece, but it's only one piece. When I look at, as we're preparing for elections here in Canada, it's the preparedness. We need to know our organization, not only the strengths of our organizations, but our vulnerabilities. And how are we going to utilize those and prepare in the future to make sure we are in a good position for that. The expectations from the public. Public expect that as the electoral management body that we're the regulator. We're the ones who are going to make sure that there's a fair and level playing field. One of the basic principles of our democracy is being upheld. And right now there's a lack of tools for many of us in doing so. Anton spoke about the platforms, and it's fantastic that they've reached out in BC, but I know from most of my colleagues across the country that's not the case. It's very challenging for those of us who don't have legislation in place to get the platform's attentions, to get them to the table and to agree. Personally, here in Ontario, we've been over a year trying to negotiate an MOU with Meta, and every time we get a little closer, they take a step back, right? So those are frustrations. The other area I think that we haven't talked about is time. Here in Canada, we have a very short electoral calendar, right? In some jurisdictions, it's 28 days, upwards of maybe 35 days. And when misinformation, disinformation hits in that period of time, the ability for an electoral management body or a regulator to be able to ascertain exactly if that's real or not and to take appropriate steps and actions is really challenging in such a short electoral campaign. So I think it's the lack of a complete toolkit that we have is one of the most difficult issues I see.
Thanks for that. I want to pick up on one of the things that you mentioned in there and sort of the ways in which some of these issues happen so quickly that they can really have consequences, not just for the electoral process itself, but also for how citizens think about the electoral management bodies. I'm a public opinion scholar, an admitted one, for better or for worse. And so one of the things that I think I really worry about in all of this is even if you have the tools in place, even if you follow through with your tools that you have to address this, that it might erode citizens' faith in the process, in your institutions, but also the process more generally. So I think this is going to be a real issue, especially with the election coming up south of the border in the fall, where electoral integrity in general is going to be really front and center. So what else can we do to ensure that the ways in which misinformation circulates and the tools that we have to address it don't erode faith in the democratic process more generally in Canada, but also elsewhere?
I think you're seeing a shift, and we heard it yesterday in some of the conversations, the gentleman from Microsoft indicating that now they're sort of pushing information towards electoral management bodies. All the electoral management bodies in our country are all talking about the same thing. We want to be the trusted source of fact. We want to be the purveyor of that, but there's a way that we need to get to that. And it's actually going to include all of you in this room. I'm going to touch upon that. To me, there's a 4-step process for us getting to that trusted source of fact. First and foremost, electoral management bodies need to be much more open. We need much more transparent in providing information. We need to be honest. We need to provide factual information and frequently, more often than we have in the past. I'll give a shout out to Elections Canada. The introduction of their electoral facts is a perfect example of a tool where they're proactively saying, come to us, get the factual information, utilize us in that fashion. The second piece, and I'm going to call it the media here. In Ontario, I do a ton of media before every election. I fundamentally believe in being the face of the organization, and you need to humanize. You can't hide behind Elections Ontario or Elections Canada. You need to have a face of that. Now, this is a bit of a double-edged sword, I will tell you that. I'll tell you a very quick story. A couple of years ago, I was in Windsor, and my staff had arranged. I met all the returning officers and their key staff in the morning, and I was doing all kinds of interviews in the afternoon, editorial boards, television, and we were doing a series of radio hits. And I went to this one radio station, FM, and the DJ's like, hey, Greg, man, tell me what's going on. So I'm like, okay, let me tell you all the new things we're doing. We're doing all this, we're doing that, blah, blah, blah. And then 10 minutes later, we drive to CBC, and the radio says, so, Greg, tell me about the electoral process. Well, let me tell you all about the things, and I'm back doing that. My communications director is waving her arms on the other side. But I do fundamentally believe that there needs to be a face of the organization, and we need to be much more proactive, and we need to use our media partners. I always tell them that they have a role in our democracy. It's not only about going and covering the leader and the issues of the day or the local candidates and that. It's about talking about democracy. It's about ensuring that Ontarians and Canadians as a whole, that we understand the importance of voting in a healthy civil society. So that's number one. Number two for me is share info about the process, especially when the process is changing. Often at times we have electoral laws that change, and we as the administrators, we need to be proactive. We need to get out and talk about that. We need to tell them what's new, what's happening. And we also have to set expectational values, and I see this as always a bit of a challenge, right? If you're doing a hand count for electoral ballots, you want to tell the media, you want to tell the public, you want to tell everybody, hey, the polls close at 8, we're not going to have results until 10:30. If you're using a tabulator, you better be telling them when you expect the results, right? Because it's that vagueness, and when you don't talk about that, you open the door to more misinformation and disinformation because there's that gap. And I think we need to, be a little bit more involved in that. And I think there are partners that you can use in that. Political parties are not the enemy. Candidates are not the enemy. They're the ones that we need to utilize in providing this information so that they understand, because they're the first ones the media are going to go to. If results are slow and they say, oh, no, the CEO and Elections Canada and our meetings, they told us we're not going to have results till 10:30 or 75%. So, back off. It's fine. Third thing we need to do, and this is a call out to everybody here, we need to invest in partnerships, right, at all levels. Whether it's digital, literacy programs, whether it's grassroots programs. And I'm going to do a call out here today to all of you. If you're here and you're a not-for-profit, an NGO, maybe you're a community newspaper, doesn't matter, whatever. In Ontario, we have a list of 4,000 NGOs that we use or don't use. If you're not on my list, I want you to drop your card off at my station here today. If you don't have a card, write it on a napkin. Doesn't matter to me, but you need to be our partner. We need to utilize you. And on top of that, drop it off to Elections Canada too, because they need you as well, right? We need to have you as a partner at the table. Now, we may not be able to do every grassroots program with you, but what we can do, though, is we can utilize your communication networks, your contacts, your ability for us to actually engage with your community so that they get the facts and they know that we are the purveyor of facts to come to. So, and the fourth one for me, be honest and tell them what you don't know, right? There are times in an electoral campaign, it's happened to every one of the administrators in this room, there are times you don't know. You don't know what the answer is, but be upfront, be honest with them. Tell whoever the stakeholder groups are, hey, look, I don't have an answer for you now, but by this afternoon at 3, I'll get back to you, and get back to them. Even if you still don't have the answer, get back to them. Right? Because it's when you have that dearth of information, that dearth of information out there, that just leads to more misinformation and more disinformation that they're going to provide about you, your agency, and that all erodes the trust in our democracy at any one point. And finally for me, when misinformation, disinformation happens, take action. Take action. have a program of how you're going to do it. How are you going to determine, is this a deep fake video? How are you going to determine, is this actually misinformation as opposed to, or disinformation as opposed to misinformation, right? Have a look and what is the reach? What is the reach that's out there, right? So if you have somebody and you find out that they have 3 followers, probably not a huge reach. Taylor Swift goes, hey, Swifties, this great call out to you in Canada, all you 14-year-olds, you can now go vote, Swifties. You may want to actually action that, right? There's things like that. Be aware of the public landscape in what is being said. Is this political? Does it have political ramifications against political parties and issues of the day? Or is it a disruptor? Is it trying to disrupt the electoral process in some manner, right? And then ultimately make a determination of what is the harm? What is the actual negative impact that is happening by the misinformation and disinformation? And all of that should go into helping you formulate and decide, what your next step or your next course of action will be. So finally for me on this topic, I know I've been a little long-winded, I apologize for that, but I feel fairly passionate about this. We can't do this alone. Everybody in this room has come to this conference because you care about our democracy. You care about our democratic institution. Anton and I just represent, administrators that are always looking for partners, always looking to engage. Michael Warnick, who's sitting here in the front row, his last sort of comment to us yesterday, which I wrote down, was, get it done, get involved, get everybody be part of this right now. And he's 100% right. We need all of you in this room at every level. Sorry, and there was one other group I want to call out. Sorry, I want to make sure I capture all the people I need to call out. Academia. There's a lot of academics in this room, Laura Stevenson, Holly, et cetera, Allison, and we all at different levels, we work with you. But we need to do more. Electoral management bodies are a treasure trove of data, but we need you to help us. We don't have the expertise in any agency to be able to digest and make sense of all the data or see what the data is indicating to us as signs of problems coming or issues that we haven't actually formulated now. We need to have more partnerships with the academia community. So I encourage you all. We want to work with you and we want to make sure that you're part of that overall ecosystem in helping make our democracy healthy and strong.
Great, thank you, Greg. So with that in mind, I'd like to actually engage everyone in this room in our conversation as well. So I'd invite you to ask questions. Please identify yourself. Many of us know each other, but for those who don't know you already, please identify your name and what organization you're coming from. And please pose a question. I love to talk, I'm an academic, but hopefully there's a question at the end of your interventions as well, or something that we can react to. So I see we have a mic that can go around. If you raise your hand, I can bring you into the conversation. We have one over here, and then next will be up here.
Thanks, and thanks for the insights. My question has to do.
Can you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm Josh Kilberg. I'm with the Cyber Center, part of CSE. My question to you, I think, really, like both of you touch on a key point, which is what is the plan to bring down the delta between identifying disinformation and calling that out and responding to it? Because I think both you, Mr. Essensa, both of you pointed out that it's about identifying it and then about calling it out. But you also pointed out that the writ period is really short. And so what's the plan for sort of responding to that quickly? Thanks.
Anton, do you want to jump in there first?
Yeah, I can certainly speak to some of the things that we're doing. Obviously, I think I mentioned in my initial comments that you need to have both mechanisms that can respond to complaints coming in or can respond to input from the public. The public is often our greatest source for non-compliant things that are at play in the election environment. But you also need to be proactive in terms of looking out for things and understanding where they're happening. So part of that, just picking up on what Greg was saying, is in terms of partnerships. So we have a number of partnerships. We have one with the what is the ecosystem project, Aidan? Yeah, so the Media Ecosystem Observatory, which is run out of McGill University, they are running their program. They've done it at the federal level. They've done it in Quebec. They're doing it much more broadly and at a deeper level in BC. Will be running concurrently with us as one way of monitoring what's happening in that space, monitoring where disinformation is taking place, and we'll be able to understand, the impact of that through there. We're continuing a partnership we have with Elections Canada to get visibility into some different languages, ethnic languages, different media spaces that are there in BC. So you need to have both that proactive looking out for it as well as being able to react. I think the other piece about that is you need to have your systems in place and your criteria in place so that you can very quickly separate the wheat from the chaff, to use an analogy. I think it's clear, there are restrictions in BC, but they're not blanket restrictions. They don't apply in all cases. As you said, it's during the pre-campaign or during the campaign period. It has to be made with the intention of affecting the results of the election. It has to be knowing that it's like knowingly false or with reckless disregard that it's been false. So we have to be able to assess that. And then also there's, I think with any administrator who is enforcing these rules which touch on some of the charter values, there has to be a balancing. It can be it can be done rather quickly, but you need to kind of balance the intent of that statutory enforcement program with its impact on, charter values like free speech. And so there is some flexibility in there to, determine, the seriousness of it. Is it kind of a minor misstatement? Could it be misinformation? Could it be inadvertent? Or was it deliberate? Was it kind of an outright voter suppression kind of tactic? Greg mentioned if it's Taylor Swift who is, sending this out on social media, right? What's the broadness of the dissemination? If it's someone who has 3 followers on X, we're not going to respond to that. That's not relevant in our context. But if it's someone who has 6 million followers, of course, that's important. And I think as well within the election cycle, if it's at the very beginning or if it's in the pre-campaign period, there's more time to react to that. There's more time to debunk that, to be able to counter with the correct information. So I think those are kind of always that we're looking at doing that within that narrow window. The other piece that I would touch on is just more to reinforce. Greg mentioned the electofacts piece that Elections Canada is doing. I think all agencies are really looking at trying to pre-bunk the types of disinformation that they expect to see during an election. A lot of these issues they're repeated, tropes that you see happen south of the border, they happen in other countries, and to try to have a register of election myths that you can pre-bunk before a campaign period.
Mm-hmm. Greg, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, just very quickly. As Allison indicated at the beginning, misinformation, disinformation has been in an electoral process for 150 years, right? Go back to the old days, you still saw it in signage, don't trust Anton Boegman, he's declared bankruptcy, et cetera, et cetera. And that's been around forever. The internet just accelerated it. But the new issue now is AI has just sort of, thrown gasoline onto the fire. And the reason I sort of bring all of that up is we're in an era now where we really don't fully comprehend what this is going to look like. And I think what we have to do is very much what Anton says. We have to use everybody in their skill set to help us evaluate and understand that. Electoral management bodies in our country, here in Canada, often will look to other jurisdictions for initiatives. So I think there will be a lot of eyes on Anton in the fall in BC and Saskatchewan in their elections. Obviously, Elections Canada next year having an election. Thanks to Michael, we're going to be doing a proportional representation election in Ontario. But I think we have always looked at the expertise and actually the actual implications and how things actually unfold. So I think we'll be looking a lot to see what happens not only in our elections here in Canada. There's a big U.S. election coming in November. How we anticipate where disinformation, misinformation goes, deep fakes, et cetera, and then how are some of the regulators been able to enforce the rules, content, is there missing pieces of legislation, et cetera. So I think that's what we'll all be doing.
Great. So I know I have some more questions in the audience in political science, and we called them two-finger questions, and I see Michael has a two-finger question here on this point, so I'm going to jump to him, and then our next question is the person up here.
Just a practical question, is this English only? So what happens when the disinformation is on a Chinese or Punjabi or other platform? Because that's where a lot of it is playing out.
Yeah, no, it's not English only, it's in any language. And that's, as I mentioned, we have the partnership certainly with Elections Canada and through other partners to have visibility into those foreign language platforms like WeChat and some of the ethnic media that's in BC.
So our next question is going to be up here.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Good morning. Thank you so much for kicking us off today. My name is Melanie Thomas, and I'm with Community Foundations of Canada. I really appreciated the toolbox, like the full set approach. And from a technology angle, I have two quick questions. One is, what opportunities do you see artificial intelligence having to support democracy? And in a few circumstances, and probably many circumstances, we see the misinformation, disinformation online coming from a few sources. And so how are the approach kind of tackling the few versus one off, and then you're constantly in a chase after really the same few who are spreading misinformation, disinformation? Thank you.
Greg, do you want to jump in there first?
I'll take the first part of that question. I think every electoral management body in our country is looking at how we use AI in a number of facets and a number of means. Larger jurisdictions like ourselves, Elections Canada, we have input channels that come into us where we literally get thousands and thousands of requests on various issues. But often those requests are, where do I vote? Am I on the list? How do I get a job? Like you can actually segment 75% of those. So the advent of AI and using those tools to reduce some of the labor or human resources that we use, I think is very high. I think there's lots of other aspects of AI that we're just at the very beginning of looking at. As I mentioned earlier to the academia community, we have a treasure trove of data, but we don't necessarily use it as effectively as possible in our decision making. And I think as we move forward, the utilization of AI, the ability to crunch that information and working with the academia community can help actually show us, here are some potential issues and opportunities for us to actually move ahead with the democratic process. Here are some challenges that we need to see from the outset. I'll let Anton answer the second part.
Yeah, I think that actually the fact that there are relatively fewer sources of a lot of the disinformation makes it easier for regulators because they can be more easily identified. And as I said, we've had, I think, quite good cooperation with the platforms now that there is legislation in place in British Columbia in this area. I think just to reemphasize as well, though, it's not, like there's a lot of disinformation out there. Our legislation, it's not blanket. It doesn't cover every bit of disinformation that someone may want to say or put forward, but only about the specific covered areas. So that narrow casting, while it certainly makes those provisions constitutionally sound, it also, I think it's important for our agency to clearly communicate that to the voters, to the public, so that they're not looking to us to, block or to have taken down anything that's up there. It's not intended to kind of stifle that democratic debate from all sides. That's important to our democracy. But certainly it does seem to make it easier for us to be able to target where that disinformation that is counter to our laws is coming from, and then be able to issue the takedown or the notice to stop transmissions.
I maybe I'll follow up on that point because I think it gets to the question that was first asked as well. Do you think there's the narrowness of what you can address in misinformation, I think, is really perhaps useful. But do you think there's a risk in attacking specific ones that can be politicized and call into question the impartiality of your organizations? Or do you think the law is written in such a way that you can really say that this is a clear process issue, not necessarily a partisan one.
So while I do think the law has been written in that way, indeed all of, I think most election law is it's administered equally across the spectrum by election administrators. Inherently, it's a political contest, and especially with the polarization we've been seeing, the perception that if you're not for us, is you're against us, and there's a long memory of political operatives who may perceive a decision that was made against them 15 years ago as there's still that's the trend, and this administrator is out to get me, those sorts of things. It's unfortunate. I think as election administrators, we just need to keep administering the law and the provisions equally across all players in our campaigns, and really communicating at that level with the public.
Thank you. There's a question here, and then I've got a couple more hands that are on my radar.
Hi, Anton and Greg. Kim Poffnerath from Elections New Brunswick. Got a bit of a practical question. So I think countering misinformation and disinformation, first step, pre-bunking, and that's something that I think all of us are doing. But from a practical perspective, the combating it once it's already out there, small organization like Elections New Brunswick, what kind of, there's some hesitation to make recommendations on changes to legislation that we don't have the capacity to have it, to actually enforce. And as you said, short election periods, even in a fixed date election in New Brunswick, we're looking at 32 days. So what kind of capacity building did you have to do, Anton, in order to actually have the ability to enforce this legislation? Because we don't even have 20 staff at Elections New Brunswick. So the only I know something needs to be done, but making a recommendation that goes before the legislators, and then they dump something on our plate to do the, how do we address that? So what kind of capacity building did you have to do in order to be able to be ready for October?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I know certainly in the legislative development process that happens in BC, when we put forward recommendations, if there's interest in government and picking those up, they'll have a conversation with us and try to understand what the cost impacts are in relation to those. And obviously for some changes, you're going to be having to have to expend more funds because you need to have different staff doing things. For us, the capacity building piece is there's two aspects to that. One is internally, what team do we need, and whether we need net new people coming in or whether there's people in our organization, and we're a larger organization than Elections New Brunswick, not quite as large as Elections Canada or Ontario, but do we have people within our organization that have the same skill set that's necessary? Maybe they're used to having oversight over the campaign finance aspects and election advertising kind of in the analog sense that can now be applied to this area. The other way is in partnerships, because there are, the partnership we have with the Ecosystem Observatory certainly gives us much greater visibility into these things, and there's other academics that we've reached out to who have been working in the disinformation space. There's some professors at Simon Fraser who are very active in this space. I don't want to say his name because I know I will mistake it, but there's an expert on disinformation there. He's very interested in working with us. So there's ways to build that capacity both within and outside of your organization. I think part of it is government needs to know that if they're going to change the law, that there definitely could be an impact on the bottom line budget, that an agency needs to administer that. The other thing that I will say, and I'm quite open with this, is that these new recommendations that are here in BC, certainly some of them reflect what is in place federally and has been in place for a couple of election cycles. Some of them are not new; they're unique. And while we believe, they're based on best practices elsewhere in other jurisdictions, that they are the right policy tool, we're going to evaluate it throughout. And if there needs to be tweaks or changes, then of course we'll have to make those clear after the event.
Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you. My name's Murray Mullard. I run an organization called North Shore Community Resources on the North Shore of Vancouver. Our organization is a social service agency. We mostly serve seniors, families, children. We have a variety of programs. I have a very tiny program called Democracy Cafe. But my organization, along with the other organizations on the North Shore that we partner with, we serve about 200,000 people. During an election campaign or pre-election campaign, we see hundreds, if not thousands, of clients. And so we're actually well-positioned, Greg, to your point, to really be an engager of the community around this. The reality is, and I've had this chat with Anton, is that the investment in democratic engagement is so small. I have no funding, almost, or staff to do the kind of work that we need to do. It's just a challenge. And, when I've chatted with the elected representatives, everyone will say, of course, democracy, we hold that dearly. But when it comes time to actually invest in democracy, there's very little funding. And the elected representatives, I find, are interested in votes, but of course the votes that vote for them more than anyone. So one of the things I need from, I think, all players in this sector is a common voice to a variety of both public sector and private sector foundations. Thanks for the community foundations. We get a little funding from the West Vancouver Foundation. But we need voices to say we need investments at the community level and more broadly in democracy. And so really encourage you in your roles to carry that message forward to our elected representatives and to the private sector as well and community sector. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe you can both address that a little bit more, the types of partnerships that you actually have in place and how they've worked and what we can do in terms of doing more in that aspect, because I think you've both addressed the importance of actually bringing other partners in.
Yeah, I think I certainly appreciate the work that your organization does, Murray, on the North Shore. I think it's an important community voice and a community kind of organizer. One of the areas that I will be addressing in a upcoming report to our legislators kind of builds maybe more formally on what Greg has been talking about the range of partnerships. But what I have seen to be an effective model in terms of having a resilient and robust citizenry and democracy has been called, like a whole of government or a whole of society approach to countering disinformation. In particular, I've seen this in some of the Baltic countries that I've visited to observe their elections. I know Taiwan is certainly a nation that is one of, I guess, the world leaders in terms of this type of an approach. But it fundamentally requires, this shift in recognizing that it's not just an election agency. It's not just, this NGO. It's not just the elected representatives, but it's everyone, and it requires a conscious investment by governments in these types of programs, where you have, you look at the shout out to civics. They have a report that just come out across for Canada looking at the state of civics education in schools. Civics education is an area where I think there needs to be some changes in the curriculum. There needs to be more investment in that. I think it needs to be kind of across the board. I'd recommend you read the report. I scanned the executive summary last night. There needs to be NGOs that work in the fact-checking space. Some have received government funding, some do not want any government funding, so that they're perceived as being more neutral, but funding for that needs to come from somewhere, whether that's private organizations, given there's perhaps as a tie-in from what we heard from Microsoft yesterday. But there needs to be, think about, we've developed a generation of recyclers in Canada, people who put out their blue boxes, people who, put paper in different areas. We need to do the same in the disinformation space, and that really does require a whole of government approach and consistent investment.
So I have in my mind little blue boxes on all of our social media spaces where we can sort information. Greg, do you want to jump in on that comment too? Because I know
Sure.
you work a lot with partners.
We're a big believer in Ontario. We, as I mentioned earlier, we have about 4,000 NGOs, not-for-profits, that we regularly communicate with and get involved with. And I don't disagree with the gentleman's comment. We need to invest even more. And that's why I called out earlier to all of you to, sign up, drop off your information, we want you to be part of that. We need you to be part of that. I feel like Jack Nicholson and A Few Good Men. You need me on the wall. You want me on the wall. But there's truth to that. Like we can't do this alone. And you have constituencies. You have people that we can leverage and work with. I don't disagree that we need to take a bigger role, and that we need to be out there more frequently. As I talked previously about putting a face to an agency and putting people in the field to talk about the importance and health of our civil society, and that's a healthy democracy, and we need to get to that point. So I thank you for the question, because I think we all need to do more of that.
Could you maybe give us an example of how those partnerships work for those of us who haven't actually seen them working? What would that look like? Would it be, you mentioned your organization has a lot of work with your constituencies. Like, what's that look like in its most successful version?
So a couple of elections ago, through the Democratic Exchange engagement, we worked with YMCA, and they did some model polls. They would go to some new Canadian communities, and they would actually set up a poll. They would set up a poll that we actually provided to them the ballot boxes, we provided them the ballots, we provided them the screens. Some of my outreach team would go to some of those events and provide that information. We provide them contact information to get in touch with us. And that's what I mean about getting back to that idea that we are the purveyors of fact, and we want our communities to know that. We want them, when they're checking and they're seeing something on Twitter or X or whatever the heck they're looking at, or TikTok, and they go, I'm not so sure about that. First response we want is, let me check with Elections Canada. They got a site, let me check that. Let me check with Elections BC, because they're the purveyor of fact. They're the ones who can actually authenticate whether that's real or not. And as Anton indicated with the Joe Biden, deep fake, make sure that they know that that's the actual factual information. But we can only do that. We can't do this alone. We're not big enough, as Kim said, small jurisdictions. We don't have the manpower. We don't have the ability for that reach. That's why we need you involved.
Thanks. Miriam?
Miriam Lapp, Elections Canada. I'm just wondering if you are planning to do or have already started doing anything new, any new initiatives to help diaspora communities build more resilience. You talked about monitoring the media, which is one part of it, but is there anything else that you're planning or thinking of doing in that area?
Here in Ontario, we're working with a bunch of different community organizations that are putting on events. We want to help sponsor those events. We want to be part of those events. For the last probably 10 years, I go to 3 or 4 citizenship engagements every single year that I show up and speak at, because I think it's important to encourage new Canadians that one of the important rights they have is that they can now vote. And I want to be front and center. I want them to see me there. I want to be able to speak to the importance of voting in our society and ensure that they understand how they can get involved. So yes, we work a lot with communities in those particular areas of the province. We will sponsor them in some aspects. We'll provide them with materials, etc. Are we at every single one? No, it's not possible. But we still can, though. We can participate in many different means in helping them with their events.
Anton?
Yeah, I'd just say same. I mean, we do have an outreach program, and we do, we're always looking to expand where that is, where the focus of that is. One of the things that we are partnering with the Democratic Exchange, I don't see John, he's gone out, but they have a vote pop-up program that we're running in BC throughout this summer and through the fall, where they're going to be taking the voting booth and kind of demystifying that process to people, particularly within diaspora groups. So it's an area that we definitely have a focus on, but I think it's an area that we can always do better at.
Question right here.
Thank you. That's very interesting. My name is Marie-Ève Leclerc. I work here for the environmental NGO Équiterre, based in Quebec, and we're working on misinformation and disinformation. My question is more about, I know like you'll be talking about election process and like false information about the date and stuff, but what about the issues that will be discussed during the election? For example, climate change, and right now there's a lot of disinformation about climate change saying it's false or it's not human caused. How are we addressing that, and do you have algorithm already working on this? Because we will need that, and I think we need to have a big ecosystem and to be all related to each other and share information because they are organized. And here, I would like us to organize as well, like to be able to, like, this is false, let's respond to that all together. So that was all about the issues ahead of the election. Thank you.
Yeah, do you want to speak to that, Anton?
Yeah, so our mandate, of course, is just on the election disinformation or the specific false statements about candidates or election officials. Or, as I said, the misrepresentation piece. So it doesn't extend to the issues. Issues have enjoyed, freedom of speech protection and certainly are viewed differently than disinformation about the electoral process. There are no laws in Canada around truth in electioneering, so to speak. I know in Australia they have a very different, they don't have the same constitution and charter as we do. The Commissioner of South Australia administers a truth in election law, and if a party or candidate claims X or Y, they may they will be the arbiters of truth in that sense, and we are definitely not that in the debate and on the issues. So it's not an area that election agencies have a role in.
Do you think there are things that we can learn across domains from the effectiveness of some of the tools that election administrators have? So I know you've been talking a bunch about debunking before the information's out there, having trusted sources for this information. Is there some sorts of learning that we can do across these sorts of areas? Because I know, as you mentioned, disinformation is not something that's specific to the electoral process. And it seems like there's a lot of experimentation going on around what effective tools are.
I think as we move forward, particularly in this year with the number of elections that are ongoing, we've just seen Mexico's election and India's election, both of which experienced a high rate of misinformation and disinformation throughout the campaigns, particularly in Mexico. Obviously, with the UK going in the summer, eventually the US, and of course our own provinces in Saskatchewan and BC, I think we're going to learn a lot more about whether the laws that we currently have in place, or the laws that we don't have in place, are the laws that are in place, are they enforceable, are they the right laws, or do we need to relook at them, as Anton indicated earlier? Are the right tools there in place for regulators, or what do we have to come up with to be able to combat that? I think this is a really important year. Quite happy that Anton's going to go first in this regard. But I think it is an important year for all electoral management bodies here in our country. I know the Chief Electoral Officer of Canada is paying quite close attention to what's going to happen, because we all expect a federal election next year. And this might just be the testing grounds for what happens in that election. So
I think also, there are other, if you're looking at the sources of disinformation, I know there was a comment that there are certain sources, and I know, from the research that I've done, a lot of the sources of disinformation, they're organized, they're coming from foreign nation states, they're intended to, heighten divisions within society on particular issues. They're also, intended to sow kind of doubt in the institutions that we have. So I'm very interested to see how C70 progresses, and if it becomes law before the next election. There are aspects of C70 which impact elections at all levels, but if they're able to target some of the sources and require more transparency about that, then something like that may have spillover effect into areas outside of election-specific disinformation.
Thank you. We have a question over here.
Thank you. Hello? Matthew Human from Nouveau. You made a great point, Anton, about the Australian system, and I just wanted to kind of ask your opinion on it. As you guys ramp up your ability to fight disinformation in the electoral space, based on the Australian system, do you think maybe there's an advantage to actually having the election agency be the arbiter of truth in an election in both on the candidate front as well as the electoral integrity front? Would you want to jump in that fire?
That is not an area that I would want to be in. I think that it would be quite damaging for independent and nonpartisan election agencies to be in that space.
So the answer is no. We have a question here, and then in the pink above afterwards, okay?
Thanks very much. David Salvo, I represent an organization called the Alliance for Securing Democracy. We study foreign interference in democracies, and we're based in Washington, D.C. and Brussels. My question's a bit broader than mis and disinformation, but I'm curious whether the politicization of foreign interference itself, and especially over the investigation into China's interference in the last couple election cycles here, has hindered your work in any way, has shaped your thinking about how you communicate. So if you could speak to that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
There's no question it has shaped some of our thinking on what is going to come out of the Foreign Interference Commission in the report, what roles do electoral management bodies should play, might have to play, particularly around nomination contests and leadership contests. I think at this point it's too early to really finalize a position on it. I think there's still more information that needs to come forth from the commissioner. We need to also, it needs to be a broader discussion on foreign interference, and I think it's much more so than just what we've seen to date. I think there probably needs to be a lot more discussion at all levels, local levels, provincial levels, and certainly at the federal level. But to say it hasn't shaped some of my thinking, that would be a misnomer. Absolutely. There's lots of thoughts, and given that, at least here in Ontario, certain individuals were named, certain communities were named. It's very relevant. I can tell you from a political standpoint, it's very relevant with the political masters I interact with. There's a lot of discussion about it. But to come to a finalized position, I think it's just a little early at this point.
Do you want to add anything, Anton? So we have a question up here.
Mike, okay, thank you. Yeah, so good morning. My name is Julie Jesta, and I work for South Vancouver Neighborhood House. And we serve people with disabilities as well as seniors with mobility issues. And my question is actually always an ongoing question from our community members that they want to vote, but they don't know where to go, and as well as, is there any support for people with disabilities to go to the voting station? Thank you.
I think every electoral management body has every electoral management body have various programs to assist those with disabilities to vote, and depending on the jurisdiction. Here in Ontario, we have technology solutions that an individual can vote completely independently if they wish. Within the statutes, I would say right across the country, there are provisions that allow for a friend of an elector or an election official to assist them, depending on their disability. Here in Ontario, we have what's called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. It requires me to ensure that every voting location is accessible, and if there is one that isn't accessible, we can transfer the person's vote so that they can vote at a facility that is accessible. Accessibility is a big component. It's part of our strategic plan. It's part of our strategic viewpoint. And I think I can say it for virtually all of my colleagues across the country. Accessibility and ensuring that those with disabilities, because as our population ages, we expect that we're going to see more and more of the electorate who have some form of a disability.
I don't know why that's cutting out. Was there one other hand? There's a hand right here. Apologize for making you. So we have time for this question and one more. So I see a hand up there. You're the lucky winner. And then I'm going to close with one final question for our panelists. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Paul Jorgensen. I'm with Elections Canada. Greg mentioned the lack of a complete toolkit as one of the major challenges. This is a question for both. I'm wondering if each of you were given, let's say, a magic wand, and you could insert any one change that is currently lacking or nascent in your provincial election act, and insert any sort of tool in your missing toolkit, what would that change in the legislation be, and what would that tool in the toolkit be?
You do not want to give me a magic wand.
Oh, we might.
There's a whole ton of things I'd like to do with that, but for just one. For me, it would really be commonality amongst legislation. That this is an issue that impacts all of us. It doesn't matter the level. It's going to impact municipal elections. It's going to impact provincial, territorial, and federally. And what I would love to see is commonality amongst what the legislative framework is. What are the regulations around misinformation and disinformation? Define our role, if there is a role for us, and if not, where is the role? And I think it's important for us to really sort of define that line. And my fear is that it's sort of happening haphazardly. You know, we see in Elections Canada, they got a bill that's been languishing at Parliament. BC's moved more aggressively. Other jurisdictions like us, I've written multiple reports and in my annual report, and the legislature is like, yeah, we'll get to it, Greg. But I think for me, that magic wand would be to have one seamless piece. Everyone in this room gets to vote at all three levels, right? Have that seamless way that we are going to manage misinformation and disinformation.
Anton, what would you do with your magic wand?
Yeah, I think my perception would not necessarily be to change kind of one piece of legislation, but really to future-proof our legislation, because, you know, these types of issues are evolving. You know, we're talking disinformation here. Yesterday, you know, kind of teased AI. I think that's the next, certainly the huge area of focus. And much electoral legislation in Canada is very prescriptive. And I think it needs to become less prescriptive. I think it needs to enable more flexibility, whether that is through you know, subordinate legislation like regulations of the CEO that allow for you know, for tweaking, to enable legislation to stay at pace with the issues, with the policy objectives and what you're trying to do, whether that's on accessibility, whether that's on countering misinformation, whether that's in electoral finance and these sorts of things. So that would be my magic wand.
Great. We have one final question from the audience all the way up at the top.
Hi, good morning. I'm a journalist, and I've recently moved to Canada. Coming from India, I was just curious to know, especially with the Indian elections, there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation that was spreading through WhatsApp groups, like family WhatsApp groups, and on a very local level. And I see that within the diaspora community here. So I was wondering what your views are on tackling disinformation and misinformation that gets spread through family WhatsApp groups and these community WhatsApp groups. Thank you.
So what can we do at the very sort of small social network level of the ways in which this information is circulating?
Yeah, so I mean, for us to, you know, with the new provisions to be able to address things like that, we have to have visibility into it, and that's one of the challenges in terms of some of the end-to-end encrypted private chat groups is knowing what is in there. So someone would have to be in that group, would have to see the disinformation, would have to report the disinformation, and then we would be able to, you know, use the policy tools that we have available. But I think for any regulator, that is one of the challenges is having visibility into the spaces where disinformation circulates, whether that is in you know, foreign language media, whether it is in, you know, WeChat or foreign language apps, or whether it is through encrypted, you know, whether it's in WhatsApp, whether it's in Telegram, whether it's in Signal, and or these different types of spaces.
you want to add anything to that, Greg? So I think some of our conversation today has really pointed to not just the tools that you have at your disposal, but also how it's an issue that really goes far beyond election management bodies in this country and elsewhere. And so I wanted to give you both an opportunity to, make suggestions to the audience that hear of what else needs to be done that's not necessarily in your purview. So if we're thinking about effective policy informations beyond the scope of election administration, are there things that you think other actors would be in a better position to do to help in the fight against mis and disinformation during the election process?
I'll be very short because I think I've already mentioned it when I touched on this kind of whole of government or whole of society approach. I really do think that there needs to be a fundamental shift in how governments and how societies view the issues that we're facing. I think it is much broader than an election agency responsible for this. And I do think we need to look to those nations that have been successful in this, particularly the Baltic states and areas like Taiwan, that have put in place processes and programs resulted in increased trust in government, increased trust in their institutions, and a much more resilient voting population.
I would just add to that as some of my earlier comments, and I know Anton echoed this, we can't do this alone. We need people in this room. We need, other entities in our society. I was looking at Josh, the Center for Cybersecurity. We need to work at all levels with that type of intelligence and that type of rigor and utilize the expertise at every segment of society to help combat this, to help us find the right path forward as Canadians. The one thing, I've been doing elections in our country. I'm in my 39th year of running elections. And I can tell you, worldwide, we are incredibly well respected. I am invited to elections. I could probably do my whole career, the rest of my time in this role. I could just go to one election after another because we're invited to them all because we're so highly thought of. And I take great pride in that. And I think what we collectively need to do is we are seeing these fissure cracks in our democracy, and we feel strongly. You're all here because you feel strongly about our democratic institution and democracy as a whole. We need to collectively work to maintain that and improve that and sort of thwart off these new emerging threats that we see. But I'm encouraged by all the people who are here, all the ones I've spoken to, because I know that there's that passion to ensure the health of our democracy remains.
So I'm hearing lots of invitations for collaboration and coordination and to take the energy that we have about these issues, through legislation, but also through lots of other forms of interventions that we can do at a very individual, local level, but also more broadly. So I'd like to thank you both for your organization's commitment to these issues, but also taking the time to organize it and to speak with us today about it. It's been a real pleasure. I always learn something when I talk to you folks, so that's great. And I will also take the opportunity to encourage you to use the networking time during lunch. The Consortium on Electoral Democracy has some fantastic partnered research projects with some of your organizations, but other organizations that are working on the ground to help bridge that divide between academic and policy questions. So please visit those posters that are in the hallway. These students who are presenting them would be very, very happy to have questions and your contact. But let's have a warm round of applause for our guests.